Welcome back. In this video, we're going to set up everything that we need to have in order to retrieve the dates that we have stored. So you see, we have the history table here with the date that we have stored. And now let's go ahead and set everything up so that we can then also retrieve the data, display it later on, which we will set up in the next video because we need to prepare our adapter and stuff. So let's get started. Therefore, I would start with the DAO always, okay? Because that's the easiest starting point. Here we need to make sure that we have the right method in order to fetch data. Okay, so I'm going to call this one fun fetch all dates. Okay, and this will be returning a flow of a list of history entities. So here, history entities. So here we need to import flow, the coroutines flow, and it is basically the same approach that we had here when we wanted to retrieve something. So here you see we have this fetch all employees where we return a flow, which also allows us to reset our UI without having to do it manually. So that's pretty cool, I believe. I think they have done a good job here. And by they, I mean Google, by setting up the code accordingly. So you can, of course, hover over it to get more details about this public interface flow. So we, of course, also need to have the query for it on top of the method. Okay, so let's go over to our DAO and add the query. So we want to select star from, and what was the name of the table that we used? I believe it was history table, right? So the IDE even helps you out here. So you can just use history table here. You don't even have to write it manually. And let me make sure that I have everything set up correctly, like so, and then it's closed like this. Okay, so we have the history table now that we get the data from, we select it, and we have this function, and let me also make it a suspend function. So fetch all dates. Okay, that should be the name, not fetch all dates, but fetch all dates. So now let's also use this function somewhere. What would be a good spot? Well, I would say a good spot would be in our history activity, because that's where we want to display the history, right? And not history entity, but history activity. It seems like we don't have it open yet. So let's go over to our history activity and let's set up a method that will take care of retrieving data. So let me set it up. Private fun get all complete dates, or completed dates maybe. Yeah, basically a method that will get all of the entries from our database. And as we always do, we need to pass in the DAO. Okay, so whenever you want to do something with the database, you need the DAO, because in the DAO, that's where you define those methods, right? We want to call this method, and therefore we need to have the DAO. Right, so now this has to, of course, be done in the background. So we can use this lifecycle scope here to launch our coroutine, like so. And I'm just going to use this history DAO that was given to us to fetch all dates. And then we use this collect method, if you recall, to then say what we want to do with the it, which is a list of history entities. So I'm going to give this a proper name. I'm going to call this one all completed dates, like so, and it's a list. So this is basically just a way to give this it thingy here a name that you can use. So I'm just saying, okay, I'm going to go through this list, and for now, for every single entry of my all completed dates, I'm going to display them on a log. Okay, so I'm going to add this error log entry, and this should be with a capital L, and import it. I'm going to just say the date, colon, and then the actual date with a string. So string, empty string plus I. Okay, so this is for now what this get all completed dates should do. Later on, we want to display the data onto our recycler view, which we have to still set up. Okay, and something that I see that I'm missing inside of this function, because I'm using view binding, but I'm not getting rid of the view binding object. once the onDestroy method is called. So let's add that real quick as well. So here, let's add binding equals null at this point. So just to make sure that we are not running into any memory leakages or so. So now what would be a good spot to call this get all completed dates? Well, I would say directly when we get into this history activity. So let's go ahead and call it here. And now you will notice that we are missing something, right? Because we need to pass a history DAO. So how do we create a history DAO object? Well, we have used it before in our finish activity. So here you see we set up this history DAO object right here. So let's do the same thing here and pass that DAO in there. And that will be it. So now we should get the data, at least we should get it onto our Logcat. Okay, so let's run this real quick and see what we get on the log. Even though, of course, it will not display anything else. Or actually, let me see, I have some error here somewhere. And that must have to do with me using the suspend function. So let me check with our room database, and we didn't use the suspend keyword because we used the flow. All right, that was my key problem here. So inside of our history DAO, make sure not to have the suspend function for your query or for your fetching methods. Okay, because the flow will take care of the suspend stuff or of the coroutine stuff. So now this should fix the error. Let's check it out. Let's go over to the history. And of course, we don't see anything, but in the Logcat, we should see something. So how did we call this thing? We called it, let me check in our history activity. We called it date. Okay, so let's search for date. All right, and for some reason, I had to, well, rerun this entirely. For some reason, it doesn't show me the date properly. So even if I searched for date, and by the way, I changed the log entry a little bit because I wanted to actually debug it, and I went to no filters, and then it showed me the application. So maybe it has to do with me having multiple instances of Android Studio open, as well as running multiple apps on the emulator and stuff. So once you go to history, now you should see an entry. So it says here, this is the entry that it made 15th of October. Well, that's the entry that we have in our database, right? So 10/23/36. Let's look at the database to be sure. So here, after it is opened, let's go to the history table, and you see 10/23/36. So that's exactly what we see in the Logcat, which means now we can get the date. So you see, you could, of course, also log the I itself. So if you run the I, as I did earlier, it will give you the entire entity. But if you want to specifically have the date, then you can also access the date property of your history entity. Okay, so let me jump over to the history, and you see that it now gives me the history entity object, which says the date property of it is 15th of October 2021, 10/23/36. Okay, so either way is fine. And now we see that we can retrieve the data. So now it's just our next task going to be to also display the data. So let's go ahead and quickly set up a layout for our recycler view. So for the individual items of the recycler view. And I'm just going to paste it in here. It's an item history row. It's really simple stuff. So let me show you what I want to have. I just want to have the number of the exercise, so of the entry that we have, and then the date. So if we look at it, we have a linear layout, which is horizontal with a little bit of background. I have this text view, which says position, or is the text view position, which in tools says 1. And then we have this text view item, which then should display the actual date. Okay, so in tools, also in our IDE, we're going to say date, but then later on, we're going to replace that, of course, with the date that we are going to use in our recycler view. Okay, so that's what we're going to set up in the next video. So see you there.